נרננה לאדוני, נביע לצור אישנו. לכו נרננה לאדוני, נביע לצור אישנו. קדימה! לכו נרננה לאדוני, נביע לצור אישנו. לכו נרננה.
Now I remember when I first heard that Torah, I thought, what is the Torah? And why should I be studying that? Well, some people said, oh, I guess Rebecca's turned Jewish. No, Rebecca hasn't turned Jewish. Rebecca did have a Jewish grandfather. However, the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. It's the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I have to say that those 5 books are foundational for the whole rest of the Bible. So the reason we study those is because once you understand, it's like the seed form for the whole rest of the Bible. Once you understand the principles and paradigms and the patterns seen from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, then you take those same things and you bring them into the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, and make a bridge. And you suddenly see all these connections that you wouldn't have seen had you not studied Torah. So if you're joining me for the first time, this is the book we use, A Year Through the Torah. And it's by John Parsons, and you can get it on Amazon for about $38, $40. And just so you know, I pull out of this things that I find are interesting, or principles that perhaps I didn't know before, or perhaps you don't know. And that's why I'm choosing to take certain things and teach on those, as well as some of the Hebrew words that are meaningful to me, because I do teach beginning Hebrew, the language, and many of the students who've taken my class love this because that helps them with their vocabulary. So let's put on our Hebrew glasses and look at the Torah through Hebrew eyes. So what is a Chukat? A Chukat is a word that means to protect a value, to engrave, or set a boundary. Now, this is what God is doing. He's giving a Chukat, the red heifer, and the whole teaching about the ashes of the red heifer is a degree given by God that at first glance, it makes no sense to us. But once you see some of the spiritual principles through spiritual eyes, suddenly you can start seeing the principle and pattern that God is setting up in this story. Now, there's 3 types of laws in Scripture that you should know about. The first one is called an edot. It means a memorial or a testimony, or it means a witness to an event. So this is called an edot. That's that kind of law. Then there's a mishpat, which means a judgment between people. In other words, like moral and civil laws, things like that. And then there's the Chukat. The Chukat, only God knows the real reason behind it. In other words, he's looking at this because he knows the future and he understands what the outcome of obeying this will be. And I'm going to give you some hints today about what this Chukat, red heifer law, is all about according to the rabbis and the sages of old. So let's get started. Now, the red heifer, what is that? Well, a red heifer is a female cow. And the name of it in Hebrew is the Parah Adumah. Edom is red in Hebrew, and Adumah is the color of red, like the earth, red clay. Now, this red heifer was to be without blemish and completely red. It couldn't even have one black hair. And it says it had never worn a yoke. In other words, that's free from any influence of man. So right there is our first spiritual principle: without the influence of any man, and it was of the earth. In other words, identifying with the red of the Adumah. Okay, so it was free from the influence of man, and it does what it is naturally designated to do. Okay, that's another principle. God ordained this animal to act and be a certain way. And because it had never worn a yoke, It was not influenced by humans. It would do what God created it to do. So this is another hint spiritually that of the earth, we have to depend on what God tells us we're to be and do. So that's the second principle. So in this story, Eleazar, which is the son of Aaron, remember he's the high priest, he makes these sacrifices in the Holy of Holies. Well, this one's different. This one's to be taken outside of the city of Jerusalem. He was to take this red heifer outside the camp and burn it completely. The skin, the organs, the bones, and the dung on a pyre of fire. Any outsider that viewed this could watch this dramatic death. Eleazar was to throw then into this fire cedar wood. Remember, cedar's a picture of strength. Hyssop is a symbol in the Bible of humility. And scarlet yarn is a symbol of hope, that red scarlet thread. It's the thread that goes through the whole Bible, by the way. So those three things, strength, humility, and hope, all have spiritual principles that one day we will see when the Messiah comes. Okay, so that's giving the people a picture of what we'll see and what we have seen played out in the new covenant. So that's the first principle, and the second and third. All right, so it was to be in the midst of the fire. And so this is like a picture of Jesus, Yeshua, coming in the midst, our midst on earth, and being a sacrifice. So then he was to take the ashes from this sacrifice, burned sacrifice, and put it in living water. In Hebrew, that word is chayim mayim, and it was to atone for their sin. And remember the golden calf? Well, that was the beginning of their rebellion against Moses. Remember that? I just see a typo here. So it was the first time they rebelled. So this is a continuation of more sacrifices that God is having them do for sin. So anyone who was in contact with anything that was dead or unclean or defiled was then to be sprinkled with this water and the ashes of the red heifer. Now, looking a little bit closer of the word parah for the heifer, it's parah. Anything with a P and an R in Hebrew is something to do with like fruitfulness or progenitor, and that's why this female would be the one that could produce another cow. So it's a producer of new life. So there's another spiritual principle. It was a female producer that could produce new life. What kind of life? Spiritual life. So the person would be sprinkled with the ashes of this sacrifice along with the living water, and their contact with death would be cleansed. See, this is all a picture of what Yeshua did on that tree in the New Testament. He was the sacrifice, and his death, he died in our place, was the sacrifice that would free us from sin and death and cleanse us from our guilt and of our sin. So this is the red heifer being played out here. Interesting, they would take it across the Kidron Valley. Here was the city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim in Hebrew, and there was once a long bridge from there to the Kidron Valley, across the Kidron Valley to where the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the parah was burnt there on the east side, facing the altar of the temple. They were facing, all altars face east, if you didn't know that. Every Jewish synagogue throughout the world, the altar always faces east, because that's where God is coming from. And that's where he will come from when he comes to bring final judgment. So anytime you see something facing east, it has to do with God and a judgment or atonement. So They're in now the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where this would take place. This red heifer, the progenitor of new life. So Eleazar took some of the blood of the red heifer and then sprinkled it 7 times toward the altar in the tabernacle or temple. And this was played out all through history. So this is what we're seeing here in this story. Now, the mixture of the water and ashes was called the waters of separation, or Mei Nida. Here it is, Mei Nida. Remember when we had the other story in the past of the woman who was considered unfaithful to her husband? She would drink the waters of Nida, meaning that she would drink again ashes and water for guilt, because this distanced her because of her sin. Well, here again, the distance of all sin keeps us from our relationship with God. And so God is making a way for the people to be cleansed from this distance. So the word separation or distance is nida. Okay, and it's the same word, by the way, for that menstrual cloth of the woman who was going through her menstrual period, and she would be considered unclean. So this cloth was called the nida. And that symbolizes in the spiritual realm our good works that are associated with death and distance. So our religious good works cannot cleanse us inside. We can only be going through religious things. But the real cleansing comes when sin, that sin nature, is cleansed in us. So when there is death, this menstrual death, we talked about it last week, it meant that the uterus was in no shape to bring forth new life. So that's the spiritual principle. We're in no shape to bring forth the life that God demands when we're in our fallen, unclean state, and we are distant from him. Remember, Isaiah says, your sins have separated you from your God. He has turned his face and will not hear, because he can't have a relationship with anything that has relationship to death, except when he gave his own life, his own death, which reversed the curse and gave us back life. Do you see this principle? So the water of separation. But in connection with these ashes of the red heifer, death and distance was atoned for, and the defiled one was given new life. This was done on the 3rd and the 7th day. And you're thinking, why that? That is weird. Why the 3rd and the 7th day? Well, let's look at that a little closer. From Moses to the destruction of the second temple, did you know there were 9 red heifers that they found that were perfect? And the rabbis believe that the 10th one, they haven't found any since the Messiah was gave his life on the tree. They haven't found that 10th one yet. And they believe that when the Messiah returns, that he will be, they'll find a red heifer to sacrifice. And what they don't know is that the Messiah was a picture of that red heifer all along. Okay, so the Mashiach, the Messiah, conquered death when? On the 3rd day. So isn't it interesting? They said, do it on the 3rd day. And then it said he would banish all distance. And that is a picture of the 7th feast day, when God would come and tabernacle with us. So it's pointing to what the Messiah did by rising from the dead on the 3rd day, and then the 7th meaning the day of rest, or when ultimately we will rest from all works because of what he accomplished on the tree. So that is the beautiful picture. Now I wanted to show you, this is a picture I took when I was in Israel. And so here it is. This is the Kidron Valley here. And this is the Garden of Gethsemane, where they would take that red heifer outside the city. What's interesting is the Jewish graveyard there. I can see that spelled wrong. I got to correct that. Okay, so anyway, what's interesting is all these graves. The Jews believe that it's important to be buried there, so when the Messiah comes, they'll rise from the dead right there by the city. And what is so beautiful is to go there and see all these tombs, and this Absalom's tomb here, David's son. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a picture of that outside the city. Now, I wanted to show you something else that was interesting about this Garden of Gethsemane. They're taking the bull out to that place. Now, isn't that the same place where Jesus went the night before he was going to be taken in by the guards? It said he went there to pray, and it says he cried tears of blood. Now, that is a Hebrew idiom, by the way, because they call tears the blood of the eye, because it's what we're feeling inside, like the blood. The water is the blood is our life. So when we're crying, it's the emotions expressing what's going on inside, and they call that the blood of the eye. So look at what that word is for blood. It's dam. Now look, the word for Adam is Adam, and it's the same root. They just put an aleph in front. So it's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, meaning strength. So it's the strength of the blood, or the first blood. And that's where we get Adam's name. He was the first one, right? The first man. And because of his fall, all men now have sinned and are in the sinful state. So that's why the Messiah is called the second Adam, because he reversed the curse from Adam. And then he came from heaven to earth to take on the flesh of a man. So in other words, he came to do what Adam couldn't do. So earth is Adamah, and we see that again, the root here, the Dalet Mem. And then Adumah is where they get the red heifer. Adumah is just the name, a former it's a grammar, different type of grammar, but Adom means red. Okay, para is female for fruitfulness. Okay, and then she's never worn an oak or a yoke, and that's the word ol in Hebrew. In other words, they call this a virgin because she's never been affected by a man. You see that? So what was the problem? Death and distance, right? What was the provision? Well, sprinkled with the blood and the waters of separation. And notice we saw cedar, hyssop, and scarlet yarn. Well, we saw that in the past too, didn't we? Remember back in Leviticus when the leper was cleansed with the water, the living water, and the blood of the bird. Remember all that? We saw hyssop and scarlet and cedar also in that cleansing. So it shows up again here in this story of the red heifer. And then what would be the proof? Well, they would be considered clean and acceptable and relationship restored. And there you go, the promise of the restored relationship. And that's our form of worship, is to draw near, because now we're pure, we're considered clean. And so this is such a beautiful picture when you break it down. Now the whole community came to the desert of Zin, and it says, and there Miriam died right after this story. And it says she died in a city called Kadesh Barnea. Now, this whole community, that's another word, Edah, meaning to dwell in unity. And remember, I said that an edut would be a witness, or a law where you witness a principle. Well, here it is, the word community. So the whole group of witnesses came to dwell in the desert of Zin, and now this is where Aaron and Moses' sister Miriam died. And the Talmud says that Miriam died in the night and was buried by her brother Moses, but he couldn't properly mourn those 30 days because of Israel's urgent lack of water. And God told Moses to go and speak to the rock, and it will give them drink. This may have affected, they say, his anger at that point when he struck the rock twice, saying, "You rebels, must we bring water from this rock?" And there's a question there. Who's he talking about? Moses and God, or he and his sister are both upset because they couldn't mourn the death at that point. So that's questionable. So, oh no, did Moses really do that and say that? Oh boy, here we go again. So the sages say that the rock that followed Moses in the desert would actually spring up when Miriam would sing. And that is how it came to be known as Miriam's well. Isn't that interesting? The rock that provided water for Israel stopped producing, however, after Miriam's death. So all the people were saying, well, where's the water? Miriam's gone. Where's the water? So the community, kahal is another word, grumbled against Moshe. We have no water. And what happened? They start saying, we wish we had died with our brothers in the desert. Remember good old Korach that we just covered in the last session? Okay, so the whole community is grumbling. And I'm like, oh boy, they haven't learned their lesson yet, have they? And Moses said, must we bring this water forward? The we word caused Moshe to go wayward. That's what I always joke about. So be careful when you say, when you're doing something in God's name and you get all puffed up as if, I'm going to teach you a spiritual lesson. Watch this. Be humble. Be humble before God. And sometimes in our anger, in our emotion, we can get puffed up and take things into our own hands. So Moses would not go into the promised land because of his anger and pride. So these are two things that we see people that God did use, yes, and did love, yes, and did want to bring to the promised land, but never made it because of pride or anger, right? Or taking things into their own hands. Only God should get the glory for any miracles that are done in our life. So I wanted to show you the kind of water that came from the rock for these millions of people. Think about Niagara Falls. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you can go on and watch the falls on YouTube. And it said that Niagara Falls can produce enough water in 17 seconds to sustain 2.5 million people with 40 gallons each per person in just 17 seconds. That's how much water is gushing over these Niagara Falls. And they said this is what it would have had to look like coming from this great rock. So I just wanted to put it in perspective real quick. So in Judaism, you would be made righteous. I wanted you to understand this by standing, and I need to bring that down, in the merit of someone else. This was a known belief in the Old Testament, that you stand in those that come before you and their righteousness and their truth and what they're teaching. It's called zechut in Hebrew. And you stand in the faith and righteousness of those who passed it on to you. And that's the whole point. So Moses is standing in the righteousness, zechut, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what the promise was to bring them into the promised land, that he would multiply them and bless them. And this is what Moses taught when he brought forth the law. And he says, I'm putting before you the law of God. Choose life or death. Choose blessing or curses. So this is a picture of God wanting his people to always choose life, always choose blessing, not the other. And he was bringing them into a pagan world where that would be all around them. So the principles in this story apply to all of us today. Now, Moses was pointing back to those three people that he would stand in their merit. All three sat down, by the way, of wells, water. You see, this is spiritual principles being played out here. This water symbolizes living water, new spiritual life. And this is what Jesus said. He said, you know, I have water for you that if you drink my water, you'll never thirst again. He's speaking about spiritual principles. So God used another three people in this story, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, to bring forth this same principle. Another three people. They would bring Israel out of Egypt, and then these three were to pass on this spiritual life, which started with our father Abraham. So can you see that? So God used three leaders, all children of Amram, the Levites, to manifest three miracles. All three were to sustain Israel: the miracle of the water, the cloud, and the manna. But isn't it interesting that the water stopped when Miriam died? The cloud never showed up again when Aaron died. And the manna stopped when Moses died. They were in the promised land. So these three people brought those three miracles to sustain them, just like the Father, Son, and Spirit sustains us. Now, as the oldest, Miriam prophesied about a child, remember, who would deliver God's people from Egypt, and placed Moses in the water and saved his life. So these are all beautiful pictures of Jesus, the living water. So with Miriam's death, I already told you the water stopped. So whose righteousness now would they stand in when Miriam's gone? Israel would now have to stand in what? Aaron and Moses. And it was like God was taking away what they were to stand in one by one before he got them into that promised land. So when Aaron died, the cloud disappeared, and now there was only Moses left, who was more righteous in God's eyes, to stand before God, and he would be the last one. And when Moses died, their sustenance, that bread, stopped. And the Israelites were totally then dependent on God for all three of those things. And isn't that what we depend on today? God's truth brought about through Jesus, the gospel, the good news. And now we live in the spirit and truth. That's how we're to live. And we walk it out in our surroundings today, the pagan surroundings that we're in today, by the way. So from Kadesh, the Edomites would not let them. Now they're in the desert of Zin, and they want to go to the promised land. And they're on the king's highway. This is a trade route. And they got to the Edomite territory. And these are cousins of Esau, by the way. These were cousins, Esau. These were their people. And when they came to Mount Hor, Aaron died, and his garments were placed then on his son Eleazar. His name means helper, and the people mourned for 30 days. So they're in this place now, mourning the death of Aaron for 30 days. And they had to take this long detour around Edom for the Moabites. Okay. So the people immediately began to complain. There's no food, there's no water, and we're sick of this bread. Oh boy. We're sick of this miserable bread. It's the word kalal. Kalal means to curse something. So they were supposed to be a blessing, and all these things that God did for them were to be seen as blessings, but now they're calling that a curse. Oh my goodness. So God at that moment released poisonous snakes. Now think about this. They've been in this desert for a long time, and it never talked about the people being bitten by snakes. God was holding back in his mercy and love for them these poisonous things, scorpions, snakes, vipers. Suddenly, they're everywhere, and the people knew that they had sinned. Okay, they released these snakes, and many died. And God told Moses, take a bronze snake and lift it up and put it on a wooden pole. All who were bitten could then look to it and live. You're like, what? That's weird. Why would he put up a snake on a pole? Well, the word for snake, by the way, is nachash. And the gematria, or the number of those letters, adds up to 385. And guess what? The Messiah's name, Mashiach, also adds up to the same number. So it's like putting this thing that had bit them, sin, on a tree, on a wooden tree. And then he would reverse the curse from the Nakash, the Mashiach. Do you see that? It's just beautiful. The rabbis agree that that copper snake that was lifted up and those that looked to it were healed represents the Messiah. They just don't think he's come yet. So Nakash means copper or of the earth, to remind them of that initial bite way back in the garden, that venom of sin, if you will, that shows that paradigm in the Garden of Eden. Now in 2 Kings 18, the Israelites actually burnt incense to a copper snake called Nakashtan. And King Hezekiah of Judah tore it down along with their Asherah poles and their pagan altars. So see, even this snake became the symbol of worship. Oh my goodness. It's like, oh, remember the snake? Hey, let's bow down and worship it. Oh my goodness. They were doing what the pagan nations were doing, bowing down to things that man would look at and see lifted up and misrepresent it and then worship it. So this principle is no different today. People worshiping power, money, position, lifting it up, and in pride and in their anger and arrogance, then telling everybody else what to do, what to think, what to believe, what to say. And this is the fall that continues through all generations over and over and over. Now, the bronze snake represented the power to heal and restore. And that's what this was. Just as Satan used words to deceive the first Adam and Hava, Eve, it brought death and sin and distance. God separated them from the garden. Yeshua, the word, brought redemption from death and distance by becoming a living sacrifice. So after his resurrection, he gave them new life through the gift of the Spirit. So the bread and water both came from heaven, just as the Messiah and the Spirit were sent from heaven. All four were gifts to sustain man's life. The bread, the water, the cloud, the Messiah. All four given from heaven to sustain us from distance and heal us and bring us close. Now, Yeshua began his ministry in the same way. He was a blessing at first, just like the bread and the cloud and the water. But soon, those that hated him and were jealous and had no spiritual insight, they were the religious, the ones that loved the praise of men and people rather than the Torah, what God said. Well, they began to resent him and hate him. And he became the problem. So they needed to get rid of him and kill him. And we're seeing that today. Those that lift up truth and those that are loyal to what God says about what is right and wrong, what is holy and unholy, what is moral and immoral, you're going to be hated just like Jesus. And he said, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. So at first, what was a blessing then became the cursed people, the cursed one. And that's what we see. It says, cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree. And that's what Jesus did. Remember, I said the word for curse was kalal. We hate this bread. Okay? They hated Jesus. It also means to diminish. So this is what the rabbis wanted to do, to diminish Jesus as the Messiah. And today we're seeing the same thing, where we're disenfranchised. We're the ones that are the problem. We're the ones. It's conspiracy theory. It's all just their theory, and they try to put Christians down as if we're some kind of, meek, mild, milquetoast, brainwashed, extreme right people. But when we stand on God's truth, we're going to be hated. And just realize that. We may even be killed for our faith and thrown in prison for our faith and our Bibles taken away for our faith. And will you be willing to stand then? That's a question our pastor asked us last week. So look at Galatians 3:13. He who knew no sin became sin for us, the symbol of sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. That's what Galatians 3:13 says, the curse being reversed. This is the time for Christians to stand strong, not to be hateful and mean, but to speak truth, not to compromise, not to cave, but to speak truth in love, and hopefully pull others from the fire of that pagan spirit that we see in that kingdom of darkness in our world today. So are you going to stand in these days? I pray you will, and I pray I will, as I stay close to the one who bought me, paid for the price of my sin, and now lives in me through his Spirit. May God dwell in you, and may he give you his peace, his shalom, and may you live in his truth. In Jesus' name, amen. See you next time on Sparky Story Time.